My name is Janet, and I'm 32 years old. As I drove to my mother's 60th birthday party last Saturday, I thought this time would be different. I'd bought her an expensive pearl necklace that cost me 2 weeks of salary, hoping finally to see that proud smile I'd been chasing my whole life. The restaurant she'd chosen was upscale, the kind of place where conversations echo and every word carries weight. I had no idea that within 2 hours I'd speak words that would change our relationship forever. Before we dive into what happened that night, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, hit that like button if you've ever felt undervalued by family. And don't forget to subscribe because what happened next will probably shock you as much as it did everyone at that restaurant. Growing up in our household felt like living in two different realities. There was Marcus, my younger brother by 3 years, who could do no wrong in my mother Patricia's eyes. Then there was me, the daughter who somehow never measured up no matter how hard I tried. I remember bringing home straight A's in high school, only to have them dismissed with a casual, "Well, that's expected," while Marcus's single B+ in PE was celebrated with ice cream and phone calls to relatives. When I graduated as valedictorian, my mother spent the entire ceremony talking about how Marcus had helped me practice my speech conveniently, forgetting that he'd been playing video games the entire time I was writing it. College was more of the same. I worked 2 jobs to pay for my education while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. But all I heard about was how Marcus was finding himself during his gap year, which consisted mainly of sleeping until noon and playing guitar in our garage. When I graduated summa cum laude with my marketing degree, the family dinner conversation centered around Marcus's decision to maybe apply to community college someday. The pattern continued into my professional life. I climbed the corporate ladder, steadily earning promotion after promotion through sheer determination and 60-hour work weeks. I bought my own apartment at 28, a modest but beautiful place that I furnished with secondhand finds and careful savings. When I showed my mother the photos, her only comment was wondering why I hadn't chosen something closer to home so I could help Marcus with his job search. What really stung was discovering that my mother had been taking credit for my successes to her friends. I overheard her at a family barbecue telling Mrs. Henderson from next door that my recent promotion was really a family effort and that she'd been coaching me through the corporate world. The truth was, I hadn't even told her about the promotion until a month after it happened, and our conversations rarely went beyond surface-level pleasantries. Marcus, meanwhile, was 31 and still living in our childhood bedroom. He worked part-time at a local electronics store, showed up late more often than not, and had never held a job for more than 18 months. But somehow this was characterized as him being selective and waiting for the right opportunity. When he'd gotten fired from his previous job for repeatedly showing up hungover, my mother spent weeks calling his former boss to try to get him reinstated. I found myself in an endless cycle of trying to earn approval that never came. I sent flowers on Mother's Day, called every Sunday, and always volunteered to organize family gatherings. I'd researched restaurants, made reservations, coordinated schedules, and usually ended up paying for most of the meal. Each time I told myself that this would be the occasion when she'd finally see my efforts and appreciate me. The financial support had started small, $100 here and there when my mother mentioned struggling with bills. Then it became regular contributions to help with Marcus's expenses, since he couldn't quite make ends meet on his part-time salary. I was essentially subsidizing my brother's lifestyle while he lived rent-free and contributed nothing to household expenses. The irony wasn't lost on me that the daughter who was selfish and career-obsessed was the one actually supporting the family financially. As I pulled into the restaurant parking lot that Saturday evening, I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one more time. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a conservative dress that my mother couldn't find fault with, paired with the gold earrings she'd given me for my birthday 2 years ago. The pearl necklace sat in its elegant gift box on the passenger seat, a peace offering that I hoped might finally bridge the gap between us. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversation of weekend diners as I walked through the front entrance, gift bag in hand and my brightest smile firmly in place. I'd arrived exactly on time, but somehow I was still the last to be seated at our reserved table. My mother sat at the head of the table in a royal blue dress I'd never seen before, her silver hair styled in perfect waves that must have taken hours at the salon. "Janet, there you are," she said without looking up from her menu, her tone suggesting I was late despite being precisely punctual. "We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost." Marcus jumped up to hug me, and I noticed he was wearing the same wrinkled button-down shirt he'd worn to last Christmas dinner. His wife Sarah gave me a warm smile and scooted over to make room. I appreciated her kindness, even though I could see the careful distance she maintained whenever family dynamics got tense. Around the table sat the usual suspects of our extended family gatherings. Aunt Linda, my mother's older sister, had driven down from Portland and was already nursing what looked like her second glass of wine. Uncle George, my father's brother, sat quietly scrolling through his phone, probably checking baseball scores. My cousins Amy and David had brought their kids, who were currently trying to build towers out of sugar packets while their parents pretended not to notice. I placed the carefully wrapped gift bag next to my mother's plate and leaned down to kiss her cheek. "Happy birthday, Mom. You look beautiful." She accepted the kiss with the same enthusiasm she might show a door-to-door salesman, then immediately brightened as Marcus pulled out a small, obviously last-minute gift bag from the pharmacy down the street. "Oh, Marcus, you shouldn't have," she gushed, tearing into the tissue paper to reveal a candle set that probably cost $12. The vanilla-scented candles were nice enough, but nothing special. "These smell divine. You always know exactly what I like. How thoughtful of you to remember how much I love candles." She held them up for the entire table to admire, and everyone made appropriate, appreciative noises. Then she turned to my gift bag with significantly less enthusiasm, pulling out the jewelry box like she was expecting something to bite her. When she opened it to reveal the pearl necklace, there was a moment of genuine surprise. These weren't costume jewelry pearls. They were real cultured pearls with a 14-karat gold clasp that had required me to work overtime for 3 weeks to afford. "Oh," she said, holding them up to catch the light. "These are nice. Very nice. Thank you, Janet." Nice. 2 weeks of my salary and the most expensive gift I'd ever bought anyone, and I got nice. Meanwhile, Marcus's gas station candles were divine and thoughtful. Aunt Linda leaned over to get a better look. "Janet, those are gorgeous. They must have cost a fortune. Patricia, you're so lucky to have such a generous daughter." My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, well, Janet has always been practical with her spending." The way she said practical made it sound like a character flaw. The waiter arrived to take our drink orders, and I found myself studying the wine list longer than necessary, trying to swallow the familiar disappointment that was already settling in my chest like lead. This was supposed to be different. I'd told myself for weeks that this birthday would finally be the occasion when my mother would see me, really see me, and acknowledge what I brought to our family. Instead, Marcus was already regaling the table with a story about his latest shift at the electronics store, describing a customer interaction that involved him knowing the difference between HDMI cables, like he'd discovered cold fusion. My mother hung on every word, laughing at his mediocre jokes and prompting him for more details. "Marcus has such a way with people," she announced to the table. "He could sell ice to an Eskimo, couldn't you, sweetheart?" Marcus grinned and shrugged modestly while I bit my tongue. Last week, I'd closed the biggest marketing campaign of my career, bringing in a client worth $3 million to my firm. When I'd mentioned it during our Sunday phone call, my mother had changed the subject to ask if I thought Marcus needed a winter coat. Sarah caught my eye across the table and gave me a sympathetic smile. She'd been married to Marcus for 5 years now, and while she loved him, she wasn't blind to the family dynamics. I appreciated that she never participated in the comparison game, even when it might have benefited her husband. As we ordered our meals, I found myself automatically calculating the cost of everything. The restaurant my mother had chosen wasn't cheap, and with 9 adults and 3 children plus drinks and dessert, we were looking at a bill that would probably hit $400. As usual, I knew I'd end up covering most of it, justified by my mother's expectation that since I was the one with the big city job, I could afford to treat the family. The irony was that my apartment rent, student loans, and the monthly contributions I made to help with household expenses meant I actually had less disposable income than Marcus, who had no rent, no debt, and whose biggest monthly expense was his PlayStation Plus subscription. But pointing out these financial realities would only earn me another lecture about being money-focused and not understanding the real values of family and love. So I smiled, ordered the moderately priced chicken, and prepared myself for an evening of being simultaneously invisible and financially responsible. As our appetizers arrived, my mother settled into her favorite role as family storyteller, and I watched with growing unease as she began reshaping history in real time. It was a skill she'd perfected over the years, this ability to take events and twist them just enough to paint Marcus in golden light while casting me in shades of disappointment. "You know," she began, cutting into her shrimp cocktail with surgical precision, "I was just telling Mrs. Chen from down the street about Janet's high school graduation. What a day that was." I perked up, slightly surprised she was bringing up one of my actual achievements. Maybe this was the moment she'd finally acknowledge something I'd accomplished. "Janet was valedictorian, you know," she continued, and for a split second my heart lifted. But the real story was how Marcus helped her with that speech. He spent hours listening to her practice, giving her feedback, helping her with the emotional parts. Without his support, I don't think she would have been able to deliver it with such confidence. The bread roll I was reaching for suddenly felt like it weighed 50 pounds. I set it down carefully, trying to process what I'd just heard. Marcus had been 14 at the time, more interested in his PlayStation than my academic achievements. The night before graduation, when I was having a panic attack about speaking in front of 500 people, he'd been in his room with headphones on, ignoring my requests for help. "I remember that," Aunt Linda said thoughtfully. "Janet, your speech was beautiful. You talked about pursuing dreams despite obstacles." "Yes, well, Marcus really helped her understand the emotional resonance," my mother replied smoothly. "He's always been so intuitive about people's feelings. It's a gift, really." I caught Marcus shifting uncomfortably in his seat. To his credit, he looked like he wanted to correct the record, but years of being the favored child had taught him not to rock the boat when the current was flowing in his direction. My mother was just getting started. She launched into another story, this one about my recent promotion at work. According to her version, Marcus had given me crucial advice about office politics during a family dinner, insights that had apparently been instrumental in my success. "Marcus understands workplace dynamics so well," she explained to Uncle George, who was nodding politely while clearly trying to finish his soup. "When Janet was struggling with that difficult project last year, Marcus was the one who suggested she approach it from a team-building angle instead of trying to do everything herself." This was news to me, considering Marcus had never asked about my work beyond "how's the job going," and I'd never discussed any specific projects with him. The promotion had come after months of 60-hour weeks building client relationships and developing marketing strategies that increased our agency's revenue by 30%. Marcus's contribution had been limited to asking me to turn down my conference calls when he was trying to watch Netflix in the next room. But here was my mother creating an elaborate fiction where my baby brother was the secret architect of my professional success. The worst part was how naturally it flowed, how convinced she seemed by her own narrative. I wondered if she actually believed these stories, or if she'd simply told them so many times that the lies had calcified into her version of truth. "Speaking of work," my cousin Amy chimed in, trying to redirect the conversation. "Janet, didn't you just win some kind of industry award?" "Oh, that," my mother waved dismissively before I could answer. "It was just one of those participation things. They give them out to everyone nowadays. Not like when I was working, when recognition actually meant something." The award had been for innovative digital marketing strategy, given to only 5 professionals nationwide out of thousands of applicants. I'd worked for 8 months on the campaign, staying late every night and sacrificing weekends to perfect every detail. The recognition had come with a $5,000 prize and a speaking opportunity at the national conference. "Actually, Mom, it was pretty competitive," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice level. "Only 5 people received it this year." "Well, I'm sure you did your best," she replied, in the tone one might use to console a child who'd lost a spelling bee. Then she turned back to Marcus with renewed energy. "Now Marcus has been doing such interesting work at the store. Tell them about that customer who came in with the broken computer." And off we went into another detailed account of Marcus's retail adventures, complete with technical expertise he'd demonstrated and customer service skills he'd deployed. The way my mother told it, Marcus wasn't working part-time at an electronics store. He was running a high-tech consulting firm. I found myself studying the faces around the table, wondering if anyone else was noticing the pattern. Aunt Linda kept glancing at me with increasingly concerned expressions. Uncle George had given up all pretense of listening and was now openly checking his email. Sarah was focused intently on her salad, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But my mother was in her element, weaving these tales that simultaneously elevated Marcus and diminished me. Every story followed the same formula. Take one of my accomplishments, minimize its significance, then credit Marcus with either inspiring it or improving it. Meanwhile, his basic adult responsibilities became heroic achievements worthy of extended praise. I thought about all the times I'd heard variations of these stories, usually when my mother was talking to neighbors or friends. She'd developed an entire mythology around our family where Marcus was the brilliant, sensitive son whose potential was just waiting to be discovered, while I was the adequate daughter who occasionally stumbled into success through luck or help from others. The appetizer plates were cleared, and I realized I'd barely touched my food. My stomach had knotted itself into something resembling a sailor's rope, and the familiar ache of disappointment was spreading through my chest like ink in water. But this was just the warm-up. As the main courses arrived and my mother's audience settled in for the long haul, I could feel her building towards something bigger. There was an energy in her voice, a momentum that suggested she was just getting started. The main course service marked a shift in the evening's energy, as if my mother had been waiting for everyone to be properly fed and settled before delivering her real performance. She pushed her salmon around her plate, while launching into what I could only describe as a masterclass in revisionist family history. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" she began, her voice taking on that dreamy, nostalgic tone that I'd learned to dread. "How different my children turned out to be. It's fascinating, really, how the same upbringing can produce such different results." Aunt Linda's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, Patricia?" "Well, Marcus has always been my little philosopher." My mother continued, smiling fondly at my brother. "Even as a child, he had this deep understanding of what really matters in life. Family relationships, emotional intelligence. He's never been caught up in the rat race like some people. He understands that success isn't just about money or titles." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was some people. I was the one caught up in the rat race, presumably missing out on what really mattered while chasing meaningless achievements. "I remember when Janet graduated from college," she went on, and my heart sank because I knew this story, and I knew how she told it. She was so proud of herself walking across that stage. But Marcus, who was just finishing high school, pulled me aside afterward and said, "Mom, I hope she remembers that grades aren't everything. The real world is about people, not test scores." This was a complete fabrication. Marcus had skipped my college graduation to go to a friend's pool party. He'd texted me a generic congrats message 3 days later when my mother reminded him what he'd missed. But here he was, being transformed into some kind of wise sage dispensing life philosophy at my moment of academic triumph. "Such wisdom in someone so young," my mother sighed. "He's always been able to see the big picture while Janet gets lost in the details." Marcus was staring at his steak like it held the secrets of the universe, clearly wishing he could disappear. I almost felt sorry for him. These fabricated stories of his deep insights and philosophical wisdom were creating an impossible standard for him to live up to. How exhausting it must be to constantly be credited with profundity you never actually expressed. But my mother wasn't finished. She'd found her rhythm now, and the wine was making her bold. Take Janet's apartment situation. She continued, addressing Uncle George like she was presenting evidence in court. She insisted on buying instead of renting, insisted on living alone instead of finding a roommate or staying home longer to save money. Very impractical, very expensive. But Marcus understood immediately why it was a mistake. "I don't think Janet's apartment is a mistake," Sarah said quietly, speaking up for the first time since the appetizers. "It's beautiful, and she should be proud of what she's accomplished." My mother's smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Of course, dear, and we are proud." But Marcus pointed out that home ownership at her age is really just about ego. He said, "Mom Janet's trying to prove something to people who don't matter, instead of investing in relationships with people who do." I felt like I'd been slapped. Not only was my mother dismissing one of my proudest achievements, but she was doing it by putting false wisdom in my brother's mouth that painted me as shallow and misguided. The apartment I'd worked 3 jobs to afford, that I'd saved for 3 years to buy, that represented my independence and financial responsibility, was being reframed as an ego trip. "When did Marcus say that?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled, because I don't remember him ever expressing an opinion about my housing choices. "Oh, sweetheart, you weren't there," my mother replied smoothly. "It was during one of our private conversations. Marcus and I talk about everything. He's very concerned about your happiness, you know. He worries that you're isolating yourself." More fiction. Marcus and I lived 20 miles apart and saw each other maybe once a month at family gatherings. Our conversations rarely went beyond sports scores and weekend plans. The idea that he was conducting deep psychological analysis of my life choices was absurd. But the really painful part was watching how the narrative was being received. Aunt Linda looked troubled, as if she was genuinely concerned about my supposed isolation. Uncle George was nodding thoughtfully, as if Marcus's fabricated insights had revealed something troubling about my character. This was how it worked. My mother would create these elaborate stories that recast every normal life choice I made as evidence of some character flaw, then credit Marcus with the wisdom to identify my shortcomings. It was a systematic destruction of my reputation, carried out through the vehicle of praising my brother's fictional insights. The conversation turned to my dating life, or rather my lack thereof, and I braced myself for what was coming. "Janet's always been so picky," my mother explained to the table. "She's turned down perfectly nice men because they didn't meet her impossible standards. Career-focused apartment in the right neighborhood, college education. Marcus keeps telling her that she's looking for a resume instead of a soulmate." The truth was that I'd been in a relationship for 3 years in my 20s that ended when my boyfriend cheated with his coworker. Since then, I'd dated occasionally, but hadn't found anyone I connected with enough to introduce to my family. I'd never discussed my dating criteria with Marcus, and certainly never heard him offer relationship advice. But in my mother's version, I was a cold, calculating woman, rejecting good men for superficial reasons, while Marcus was the relationship guru trying to guide me toward authentic love. I looked around the table and saw the story taking hold. My cousins were exchanging glances that suggested they were reassessing everything they thought they knew about me. Aunt Linda was looking at me with what appeared to be pity. Even Sarah seemed uncertain, like she was trying to reconcile the Janet she knew with the character my mother was describing. This was the moment I understood that tonight was different. This wasn't just the usual favoritism or casual dismissal. This was character assassination, systematic and deliberate. My mother was using Marcus as a weapon to destroy my reputation, while simultaneously elevating him to the status of family sage. And the worst part was that Marcus was letting it happen. He wasn't correcting the record or defending me. He was sitting silently while his mother destroyed his sister's credibility, using his name as the instrument of destruction. The main course plates were cleared, and I realized the evening was building toward something. My mother had that look in her eyes, the one that meant she was preparing for a grand finale. The story so far had been set up establishing the narrative that would justify whatever was coming next. The dessert course arrived with all the fanfare of a birthday celebration, complete with a chocolate cake adorned with 60 candles, and the restaurant staff gathered around to sing. I watched my mother's face glow in the candlelight, radiant with the attention and admiration she'd orchestrated for herself. This was her moment, her stage, and I could feel the energy in the room shifting toward what I now recognized was going to be a performance. After the singing and candle blowing and the obligatory photographs, my mother stood up, wine glass in hand, ready to address her audience. The restaurant had quieted around us, other diners politely pausing their conversations out of respect for what appeared to be a special family moment. "Before we finish this wonderful evening," she began, her voice carrying across not just our table, but the surrounding area, "I want to take a moment to talk about family, about what it means to be truly blessed with children who understand what love looks like." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about her tone, the way she was positioning herself, told me this wasn't going to be a generic birthday gratitude speech. "I know I'm supposed to speak last," I said quickly, half rising from my chair, "but I'd love to say something first if that's okay." I thought maybe if I could get ahead of whatever she was planning, I could steer the conversation towards safer ground. I'd prepared a short speech in the car, something heartfelt about her strength and resilience, her dedication to family, all the things a daughter should say about her mother on such an occasion. My mother waved me back down with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, let me go first. I have so much to say, and I want to make sure I get it all out before I get too emotional." So I sat back down, my hands folded carefully in my lap, and prepared to be generous and supportive while my mother took the spotlight. I told myself this was her day, her moment, and whatever criticism might be embedded in her speech, I would handle it with grace. "When I look around this table," she continued, "I see the faces of people who have made my life meaningful. My dear sister Linda, who has always been my closest friend. My brother-in-law George, who has been like a father to my children. My grandchildren, who remind me every day what pure joy looks like." Warm applause rippled around the table. So far, so good. "And of course my children, Janet and Marcus, two very different people who have taught me very different lessons about what it means to be a mother." Here it comes, I thought, steeling myself for the comparison that was surely about to follow. "Marcus," she said, turning to beam at my brother, "has been my greatest teacher in what unconditional love looks like. From the time he was a little boy, he understood that family isn't about what you achieve or what you accumulate. It's about showing up, being present, caring about each other's hearts." Marcus looked like he wanted to crawl under the table, but my mother was just getting started. "He calls me every day, every single day. Not because he needs something, not because there's an agenda, but because he genuinely wants to know how I'm doing. He listens when I talk about my arthritis, my worries about the house, my concerns about the future. He remembers what I tell him. He follows up. He cares." This was news to me. I called my mother every Sunday and had been doing so for over a decade. But apparently that weekly call, which often felt like an obligation for both of us, didn't count as showing up. "Marcus has never made me feel like a burden," she continued, her voice growing stronger and more emotional. "He's never made me feel like my problems are too small or my concerns are too trivial. When I worry about money, he doesn't lecture me about budgeting. When I feel lonely, he doesn't tell me to make more friends. He just listens and he cares, and he makes me feel like his mother's happiness actually matters to him." The implications were becoming clearer. Apparently, my practical help with bills and my suggestions for managing finances weren't expressions of love. They were lectures. My encouragement for her to join social groups or take classes wasn't support. It was dismissal of her loneliness. "Marcus has always understood that love is a verb," my mother said, her voice now carrying clearly to the neighboring tables. "It's not about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's about consistency, presence, emotional availability. It's about making someone feel seen and valued for who they are, not criticized for who they're not." I felt my face burning. The expensive pearl necklace suddenly felt like evidence against me, proof that I was the kind of person who thought love could be purchased rather than lived. "And Janet," she said finally, turning to look at me with what I can only describe as disappointed resignation. "Janet has taught me a different lesson about motherhood. She's taught me that you can give someone everything, every opportunity, every advantage, and they might still grow up to be someone who sees family as an obligation rather than a gift." The restaurant had gone completely quiet around us. I could feel the weight of dozens of strangers' attention, all of them now witnessing what was clearly becoming a very public family drama. "Janet is successful. There's no question about that," my mother continued, and I could hear the but coming from a mile away. "She has a nice job, a nice apartment, a nice life, but success without heart is just emptiness. Achievement without love is just ego." My hands were shaking now, but I forced myself to sit still, to maintain my composure, to let her finish whatever this was. I look at my daughter and I see someone who has forgotten where she came from. Someone who thinks that sending money is the same as sending love. Someone who believes that organizing a dinner reservation is the same as nurturing a relationship. Uncle George cleared his throat uncomfortably. Aunt Linda was staring at her dessert plate like it contained escape instructions. Even the kids had stopped fidgeting, sensing the adults were in the middle of something serious and scary. "The saddest part," my mother said, and now there were actual tears in her eyes, "is that I don't think Janet even realizes what she's missing. She's so busy climbing ladders and impressing strangers that she's lost touch with the people who actually love her. She's become someone who schedules family like a business meeting and measures relationships by their return on investment." I felt like I was watching this happen to someone else, like I was floating above the table observing this public assassination of my character. Part of me wanted to stand up and defend myself, to list all the ways I'd shown up for this family, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the love I'd tried to express in the only ways I knew how. But a bigger part of me was starting to understand that this wasn't really about my behavior at all. This was about my mother's need to justify her favoritism, to create a narrative where loving Marcus more than me wasn't bias, but wisdom. So on my 60th birthday, she concluded, raising her wine glass, "I want to thank Marcus for showing me what it looks like to be truly loved by a child. And I want to hope that someday Janet might learn from his example and remember that family isn't about what you can provide, it's about who you choose to be." The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew how to respond to what they'd just witnessed. No one reached for their glasses to join her toast. Even Marcus looked horrified. And that's when she looked directly at me with a smile that was equal parts triumph and pity, and delivered the words that would change everything. "Because honestly, sweetheart, at this point, you're not even good enough to call family." The words hit me like ice water, shocking and clarifying at the same time. For a moment that felt like an hour, nobody moved. The surrounding tables had fallen completely silent, strangers now unwilling witnesses to what was clearly a family crisis unfolding in real time. But something strange happened in that moment of absolute humiliation. Instead of the crushing shame I expected to feel, instead of the familiar urge to apologize and try to fix whatever I'd done wrong, I felt something I'd never experienced in my mother's presence before: complete crystalline clarity. I looked at this woman who had just declared me unworthy of family membership in front of dozens of strangers, and suddenly I could see the entire pattern with perfect, devastating precision. This hadn't been building for 32 years because of my failures as a daughter. This had been building because my very existence challenged the story she needed to tell about herself. I was the evidence that her favoritism was a choice, not a response to our different worthiness. I was the proof that love in our family was conditional, earned through compliance rather than given freely. And most dangerously of all, I was the reminder that Marcus wasn't actually the wise, emotionally intelligent philosopher she'd created in her stories. He was a 31-year-old man, living in his childhood bedroom, supported financially by the sister his mother had just publicly disowned. I stood up slowly and I could feel the energy in the room shift. Everyone expected me to either storm out in tears or crumble into apologies. Instead, I looked my mother directly in the eyes and I smiled. "You know what, Mom?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent restaurant. "If I'm not good enough to call family, then you need to stop using my name to impress other people." Her confident smile flickered for just a moment. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but I could hear the slight uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I'm talking about how you tell Mrs. Chen that my promotion was a family effort." I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I'm talking about how you told the ladies at your book club that you helped me buy my apartment. I'm talking about how you've spent 2 years telling everyone that my marketing award was really a team achievement." The color was starting to drain from her face, but I wasn't finished. "See, here's the thing about having a daughter who's not good enough to call family," I said, pulling out my phone and setting it on the table. "She tends to keep records." I opened my photos and found the screenshot I'd taken 6 months ago when a family friend had congratulated me on my team approach to success and mentioned how proud my mother was of our marketing strategy. "This is a text from Mrs. Rodriguez," I announced to the table, reading directly from my phone. "She says, 'Your mother was just telling me how the marketing award was really a family project and how she helped you understand the client's needs. She's so proud of how you listened to her advice about the presentation.'" I looked up at my mother, whose smile had now completely disappeared. "The interesting thing about that conversation, Mom, is that you never saw my presentation. You don't know what the award was for. You've never asked about my work beyond whether it pays well. But somehow, when it comes time to impress the neighbors, it becomes a collaborative family achievement." Marcus was staring at his hands, but I could see Uncle George's eyebrows rising as he started to understand what was happening. "And then there's the apartment situation." I continued, warming to my theme. "Mrs. Patterson told me last month how impressed she was with our real estate investment strategy. Apparently you explained to her how you helped me navigate the housing market and make smart financial decisions." I laughed, and it sounded strange to my own ears, bitter, but somehow liberating. "The truth is, you told me buying was stupid. You said I should rent forever and give the down payment money to Marcus to help him start his business." "Which business, by the way?" "The one where he sells other people's electronics for minimum wage." "Janet," Marcus said quietly, finally looking up, but I held up my hand. "No, let me finish. Because apparently I'm not good enough to call family, but I'm good enough to claim credit for when it's convenient." I turned back to my mother, who was now looking around the table for support that clearly wasn't coming. "You want to know what's really interesting about tonight?" I asked. "Every single story you told about Marcus giving me advice, every conversation where he supposedly shared his wisdom with you about my life choices — I have phone records going back 3 years. Marcus and I text maybe twice a month, usually about logistics for family events. We've had exactly 0 conversations about my apartment, my dating life, my career, or my personal philosophy." Sarah was staring at her husband with an expression I couldn't quite read. Aunt Linda was looking between my mother and me like she was watching a tennis match. "So either my brother is the most inconsistent person alive, offering profound insights to you that he's never shared with me directly, or you've been making up conversations to justify treating your children differently." The silence stretched out like a held breath. My mother's mouth was opening and closing, but no words were coming out. "And you know what the really sad part is?" I continued, my voice softer now, but somehow more devastating. "You could have just loved us both. You could have been proud of Marcus for who he is, and proud of me for who I am. Instead, you created this elaborate mythology where loving him required diminishing me." I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet, counting out enough cash to cover the entire dinner plus a generous tip. "Here's the thing about not being good enough to call family," I said, placing the money on the table. "Family members don't usually pay for birthday dinners for people who don't claim them." The aftermath of my words rippled through the restaurant, like stones thrown into still water. I could see other diners pretending not to stare while clearly listening to every word. Our waiter had stopped approaching our table entirely, probably sensing that whatever was happening here was well above his pay grade. My mother's face had gone through several color changes, settling on a pale shade that made her look older than her 60 years. For the first time in my memory, she seemed genuinely speechless, her mouth moving slightly as if she was trying different responses and rejecting them all. "Janet," Aunt Linda said softly, "maybe we should all take a breath and—" "No," I said, my voice still calm but firm. "I've been taking breaths for 32 years. I've been making excuses and finding ways to rationalize this pattern, and I'm done." I turned to address the whole table, these people who had just witnessed my mother's public assessment of my worth. "I want you all to understand something," I said. "For the past 2 years, I've been sending $500 a month to help with household expenses. $500 that I save by buying generic groceries, skipping dinners out, and driving a 7-year-old car." Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. Clearly this was news to him. "I organized this dinner tonight. I made the reservation, coordinated everyone's schedules, and as you can see, I'm paying for it. I've organized every family gathering for the past 4 years. I've sent flowers for every birthday, every Mother's Day, every anniversary." My voice was getting stronger as I continued, the words flowing out of me like water through a broken dam. "I've listened to hours of complaints about Marcus's job situation, his lack of direction, his inability to contribute to household expenses, and I've quietly solved those problems with my checkbook, while being told that my real contribution to this family is learning to be more emotionally available." Sarah was looking at Marcus with an expression that suggested some conversations were going to happen on the drive home. "But here's what I've finally figured out." I continued, looking directly at my mother. "This was never about my behavior. This was never about me being too career-focused or emotionally unavailable, or any of the other character flaws you've diagnosed me with over the years." My mother finally found her voice. "Janet, you're being ridiculous. This is not the time or place for—" "This is exactly the time and place," I interrupted, "because you chose to make it the time and place when you decided to publicly declare me unworthy of family membership." I could see Uncle George nodding slightly, and Aunt Linda was looking at my mother with something that looked like disappointment. "The truth is, you needed me to be the problem so that your favoritism could look like wisdom. You needed Marcus to be the sensitive, emotionally intelligent one so that your preference for him could seem justified instead of arbitrary." I gestured toward my brother, who was still sitting in stunned silence. "But the thing is, Marcus isn't actually the person you've created in these stories. He's not dispensing profound insights about my life choices. He's not having deep philosophical conversations with you about the nature of love and family. He's a 31-year-old man who works part-time retail and lives in his childhood bedroom." "That's enough," my mother said sharply, finally finding some fight. "No, it's not enough," I replied, "because I'm tired of pretending that this is normal. I'm tired of participating in a family dynamic where one child can do no wrong and the other can do no right, regardless of actual behavior or contributions." I picked up my purse and stood, feeling lighter than I had in years. I'm tired of paying for the privilege of being insulted. I'm tired of organizing gatherings where I'm treated like an unwelcome guest. And I'm especially tired of subsidizing a lifestyle for someone whose mother just told a room full of people that I'm not good enough to call family. Marcus finally spoke up. "Janet, I didn't know about the money. I didn't know you were—" "It doesn't matter," I said, and I meant it. "What matters is that you sat there and let her destroy me using your name as the weapon. You let her create fake conversations and fictional wisdom to justify treating me like garbage." The hurt on his face was real, and for a moment I felt bad for him. This couldn't be easy, discovering that his entire identity within our family was built on lies and exaggerations. "All of these stories about your profound insights and emotional intelligence," I continued, "they're not about you, Marcus. They're about her need to justify loving you more than me. And the terrible thing is, they're probably making it impossible for you to actually become the person she's pretending you already are." I looked around the table one more time at these people who had just witnessed the complete dissolution of our family's public facade. "Aunt Linda, Uncle George, I hope you understand that this isn't about you. You've always been kind to me, and I appreciate that. They both nodded, looking shell-shocked but not unsympathetic. "Sarah," I said, addressing my sister-in-law directly, "you're good for Marcus. I hope you'll help him figure out who he actually wants to be instead of who his mother pretends he is." She gave me a small nod and what looked like an apologetic smile. Finally, I turned back to my mother, who was now looking around the table like she was expecting someone to come to her defense. "And Mom," I said, my voice softer now but no less firm, "when you're ready to have an actual relationship with your actual daughter instead of being disappointed that I'm not the fictional son you prefer, you have my number." I started to walk away, then turned back for one final thought. "Oh, and just so we're clear, the monthly payments stop now. If I'm not good enough to call family, then I'm not good enough to bankroll one either." The 6 months that followed that restaurant confrontation were the most challenging and transformative of my life. Walking out of that birthday dinner felt like stepping through a doorway into a completely different world, one where I had to learn how to exist without the constant background noise of seeking approval I was never going to receive. The first few weeks were brutal. My phone rang constantly as various family members tried to process what had happened. Aunt Linda called 3 times in the first week, ostensibly to check on me, but really to try to understand how things had gotten so bad. Uncle George sent awkward text messages suggesting that families go through rough patches, and that maybe some time and perspective would help. Marcus left voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to return. His messages went through stages: confusion, anger, guilt, and eventually something that sounded like genuine self-reflection. Sarah texted me separately, saying she was processing a lot of new information and needed time to figure out how to move forward. My mother predictably oscillated between fury and manipulation. The first week brought angry calls accusing me of ruining her birthday and humiliating the family in public. When that didn't work, she switched to guilt, leaving tearful messages about how she didn't understand where this anger was coming from and how she just wanted her daughter back. But I was already in therapy by then, something I'd started the Monday after the restaurant incident. Dr. Rebecca Martinez specialized in family trauma and narcissistic dynamics, and she had the remarkable ability to help me see patterns I'd been living inside without recognizing. "What you experienced," she explained during our 3rd session, "wasn't just favoritism. It was a systematic campaign to undermine your sense of reality and self-worth while maintaining plausible deniability." She helped me understand concepts like gaslighting, scapegoating, and the difference between guilt and legitimate remorse. She taught me about boundaries, not just the theory of them, but the practical daily work of implementing and maintaining them. The hardest part was learning to trust my own perceptions. 32 years of having my reality questioned and reframed had left me doubting my own memory and judgment. Dr. Martinez had me keep a journal, writing down interactions and conversations exactly as I remembered them before anyone else's interpretation could influence my recollection. Work became my sanctuary. Without the constant drain of family drama and the monthly financial contributions, I found myself with more energy and focus than I'd had in years. I threw myself into a new marketing campaign for a sustainable fashion startup, and the creative freedom was intoxicating. The campaign ended up winning another industry award, and this time when people congratulated me, I didn't have to wonder whether my mother was somewhere taking credit for my success. The achievement was purely mine, and it felt incredible. I also started dating again, something I'd avoided for over a year while dealing with family stress. I met David through a hiking group, and what struck me most about him was how uncomplicated our interactions were. He didn't analyze my motivations or compare me unfavorably to imaginary standards. He just enjoyed my company and told me so directly. When I told him about my family situation, he listened without trying to fix anything or suggesting that blood relations trumped all other considerations. "Sounds like you made a healthy choice," was all he said, and the simplicity of that validation nearly brought me to tears. About 4 months after the restaurant incident, Marcus finally showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't let him in, but something about his posture told me this wasn't an ambush or an attempt to guilt me into reconciliation. "I've been going to therapy too," he said after I'd grudgingly offered him coffee. Sarah insisted on it after she made me confront some things about how our family actually works. He looked different older somehow, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, genuine self-awareness. Janet, I need you to know that I never said those things Mom attributed to me. I never analyzed your apartment decision or your dating life or your career choices. I never gave her insights about your character or motivations. I nodded. I know. I figured that out. But here's the thing I'm struggling with. He continued, his voice getting quieter. I also never corrected her when she told those stories. I let her use my name to tear you down because it felt good to be the favored one, even if the favor was based on lies. This was the conversation I'd been both hoping for and dreading. I've been the golden child my whole life, he said, and I never questioned whether I deserved it or what it was costing you. I just accepted the praise and the protection and the excuses without thinking about what that meant for my sister. We talked for 3 hours that day. Probably the longest honest conversation we'd ever had. Marcus told me about the pressure of being the special one, how it had actually stunted his development, because he'd never had to face real consequences or develop genuine resilience. Sarah pointed out that I'm 31 years old, and I've never had to figure out who I am outside of being Mom's favorite, he said. Every time I started to struggle or fail, she'd swoop in with an excuse or a bailout, or a story about how my struggles were actually signs of my sensitivity. He was moving out of our childhood home the following month, he told me. He'd gotten a full-time job at a different company and was planning to go back to school part-time to finish his degree. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said as he was leaving. I just wanted you to know that I finally see what was happening and I'm trying to become someone who deserves the sister I had instead of the fiction Mom preferred. 3 weeks later, Aunt Linda called with news that my mother had been telling people I was going through a difficult time and that the family was supporting me through my struggles. Apparently, I was having a career crisis and had lashed out at the birthday dinner because of work stress. That's when I realized that even my absence was being weaponized, turned into another story that painted me as unstable while casting my mother as the long-suffering parent dealing with a troubled child. But for the first time in my life, I found that I didn't care what story she was telling. The people who mattered knew the truth, and the people who didn't know the truth didn't actually matter. I was learning to build a life based on my own values instead of trying to earn approval from someone who had never intended to give it. I was discovering what it felt like to have relationships based on mutual respect instead of hierarchical dynamics. The monthly therapy sessions were teaching me that healing doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. Some days I still caught myself wanting to call my mother with good news, forgetting for a moment that she wasn't actually interested in celebrating my successes. But most days, I felt something I'd never experienced before: peace. The constant background anxiety of never being good enough had been replaced by the quiet confidence of knowing I was enough exactly as I was. 6 months after walking out of that restaurant, I was finally learning what it felt like to be free. As I sit here today, I realize that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to earn love from people who have already decided you're not worth it. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to walk away from family dynamics that require you to be smaller, lesser, or different than who you actually are. My mother was right about one thing I did learn: what it means to be family. Real family doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make others feel special. Real family doesn't create elaborate fictions to justify treating you poorly. Real family celebrates your successes instead of taking credit for them. I may not have been good enough to call family in the house where I grew up, but I was good enough to create my own definition of what family should look like, and that, it turns out, was the most valuable lesson of all. Some relationships are worth fighting for, and some are worth walking away from. The wisdom is in knowing the difference and having the courage to act on that knowledge, even when it's the hardest thing you've ever done. If you're watching this and you've experienced something similar in your own family, I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not imagining it, and you deserve better. Sometimes the family that loves you best is the one you choose for yourself. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who didn't respect your worth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in difficult situations. And if you know someone who might need to hear this message, please share this video with them. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you are enough exactly as you are, regardless of what anyone else might say. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe that about yourself, even when the people who raised you never taught you how. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.